Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to invite you to this podcast with Michael Salamey, who is the Chief People Officer with ID Plans. And he is going to be chatting to us about leadership, about human resources, about training, his track record and his career. I have his executive profile in front of me, and it's actually a cause of embarrassment for me because there's some of the things on it. I'm like, how come one person with the same amount of hours in the day as I have be able to do all of those things? But welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. It's funny you say that. I look to other people and have the exact same feeling. I'm just like, how do they get all this done? I'm only one man.
I don't even know how you would say that when I'm looking at this, and the listeners are going to hear about it. So you are Chief People Officer. First of all, tell us, you're with ID Plans. What is that?
Yeah, ID Plans is an amazing company. This is actually my second round with them. When I first moved to Florida, I consulted for them. They hired me, and then I went back into consulting for a while, and then they hired me back. So I love the company. I've been here twice, and both times have been a great experience. And what ID Plans is a software development company that creates data analytics and all kinds of software that helps property owners, commercial property owners and commercial property managers leverage that data to do amazing things with them. So basically, we help them centralize and visualize all the data for their properties, which helps them collaborate with their vendors, their suppliers, within the organization itself, and helps them create properties that are more profitable, that run better, and have access to information that they didn't even know they needed in some cases, and certainly much more than they ever dreamed of.
Well, yeah, I know that property and real estate is very, very busy, especially it is here in Ireland, but you said that you're based in Florida. So do ID Plans just focus on the Florida area, or is it like national?
Oh no, we're national. We've also ventured out into some other countries as well, but mainly focused across the U.S. right now. Big plans in the future, but we're still working on handling the business we have now. So
yeah, well, one thing at a time. I was just thinking, actually, as a Chief People Officer, obviously I work in recruitment, and there's so many names for so many different roles. Mm-hmm. Can you explain to me and the people who listen, like, what is a Chief People Officer? Like, because it sounds like, one of those like love you titles or something like that. I'm sure there's a lot of hard work that goes into it.
There is a lot of hard work that goes into it. Chief People Officer is essentially the modern term for Chief Human Resources Officer, CHRO. So I am all things HR. I oversee the HR department for the company. And what's great about our company is that I mentioned that we do a lot of software, but we also use a lot of boots on the ground people to actually gather that data. So we don't just use software. It's a very people-centric organization, and it's one of the coolest areas where you actually see the merging of human capital with technology in a way that is very fluid and just really makes us the leader in this niche market. So yeah, Chief People Officer is all things HR. So I oversee compliance, training, development,
all the good stuff.
Yeah, talent acquisition, you name it.
I spoke to somebody a few days ago, and I don't know if HR get a bad name or not, and I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I suppose with the sales director, you can tell if a sales director is efficient or, because you look at the numbers and you can see, okay, well, they're good, and you can't really hide behind a team or the support network around you. What do you think would make one a good CHRO or people officer, or where do you think that they fall down? What their biggest challenge will be?
Well, I guess there's a couple of ways to answer that. So I think what makes a great Chief People Officer, or CHRO, or whatever title we want to go with, I think it's understanding people. It's being people-centric. Actually, SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, just released a report yesterday, I believe. I was reading it, where they had asked the C-suite executives what they valued in an HR leader, and they also asked HR leaders what they believe was the value they brought to the company. It was very interesting because a lot of the things didn't match. So the HR leaders really valued diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. They valued management and leadership skills. They valued hiring practices and talent acquisition, know-how, and things like that. The C-suite also valued those things, but in very different orders. The C-suite really put management and leadership up at the top, along with financial business acumen. And the HR leaders didn't have those things all the way till the bottom. So it's very interesting that, you know, the C-suite looks for someone who can manage and lead and develop their people, and they're also looking for somebody who holistically understands the business and can read a P&L and make intelligent strategic decisions using the data available, not just find ways to you know, re-engage employees, although that's important as well.
Yeah, it is. And I think that like what we would see a lot in Ireland is, like, you know, there's a lot of well-being programs and things that are often being like run from HR. But there's also, I suppose, this idea that on the other side, on the flip side, if you look at it, that HR is also there to solve grievances, you know, or problems and things like that, that employees often don't feel, and you can tell us whether this is right or wrong, I don't want to put you in a pickle, but employees often don't feel that HR is there for them, that they sometimes feel, well, it's for the company, they protect the company. Is that true, or is it kind of like 50-50, or it depends on the situation?
I think it's probably context dependent. So it's funny that the reason I went into HR in the first place, going back 20 something years, 20 years, was because I worked under a VP of HR who I thought was just the world's most incompetent buffoon of a human being. And I mean, I really just thought, like, there is no way this job is that difficult, and I can do this better. So I went into HR, built up a career at the highest level of HR certification you could attain, you know, MBA, all the things. And
you can say what you have, though, because I'm looking at it here, and it's like senior certified professional in human resources. And is that, I'm going to say it wrong, SHRM, how do I pronounce that? SHRM?
That's SHRM. Yep.
SHRM, that's the one that you quoted, yeah, earlier. And then presidential member of the National Society for Leadership and Success, master's degree in business administration, bachelor of business administration, I mean, this just goes on and on and on. So when you speak, like, I just want the listeners to know that, like, you've a wealth of experience, both in practice and through theory and studying. So you saw somebody who was incompetent, buffoon, I think was where we left off. And you decided to do it the right way.
So that's what I did. And then, you know, here I am 20 years later. And it turns out that he actually wasn't that bad. I mean, you know, for the time, what I didn't understand was all the boundaries that HR has around it, the compliance issues, the legal, the ethics, the moral implications of making one decision that disproportionately affects a group of people. And, you know, it's actually a lot more complicated than one might think. And it turns out that he really wasn't that bad of an HR person. So, you know, I owe him an apology if I ever meet him again.
Hopefully he's not listening.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it turns out he was actually pretty good at his job. And
so what do you think it was? It was just the constraints that were put around him, that he could only do what he could do, really. So it depends on the company, would you say?
It's more than the company. It's the political climate. It's, you know, the rules of the game, so to speak. Whereas, you know, if any company could, what a lot of employees really misunderstand about HR is that they think that HR exists for the sole purpose of making their lives better. But HR isn't psychologists. We're not psychiatrists. We're not counselors, although we play all those roles at some point or another. But essentially, a company has three buckets that they can pull from. And, you have a bucket that has all the money for overhead, the keeping the lights on, equipment and supplies is another bucket, the things that actually run the organization. And then you have benefits and payroll and all those things. And employees really want to maximize their benefits and payroll. But a lot of times what they don't understand is to do that, the money has to come from somewhere else. So do you want to have a much shorter runway for the company, meaning that if an economic downturn hits, we may be paying you top dollar, but we can't absorb that when things turn bad and we're going to have to let some people go? Or do you want to have really crummy equipment that frustrates you every day, but you're paid really well? The money has to come from somewhere. And I think that sometimes that's where people get confused. And and they see a company that makes $1 billion, it sounds like, oh, they should be sharing all that wealth. And to some degree that there's probably some truth to that for some companies, but most companies are trying to protect themselves against future disaster and also plan well for future growth, and that money is earmarked for stuff. So it's not an endless wealth or funnel. And I think a lot of employees and even HR people that don't understand the P&L struggle with that, and they just see the big dollar signs and it sounds like, well, the company is just making tons of money. No, it doesn't quite work that way. They're probably eking out a profit.
It's interesting actually that you say that, because when you look at, and I'd work with a lot of companies in America, like a lot of the tech companies, and we've seen it here that there's been a lot of like mass redundancies. And I remember speaking to, actually, I was placing somebody in a tech company, and they were offering a ridiculous salary. This person only had 2 or 3 years experience, but it was like 90K plus, and they were going to be paid in sterling. And I had said to the candidate, don't do it. One, you're not ready for the responsibility. Like, they're not going to pay you that amount. And then your learning curve is going to be like overstretched, so that's where you get burnout and all of those things, and you're just like in a constant state of panic. And secondly, if something happens, you will be the first to go. And unfortunately that happened, and I've seen a lot of layoffs. I've seen a lot of companies who have done what you've said, that like they've taken from one bucket and put it into the salary or the benefits. And some of them also hired where they might have had, like, for example, 6 tech recruiter roles, and they'd hire, because of the shortage of candidates, they'd hire like 8 to 10, and then whoever didn't work out, or if they needed to make layoffs, that was who they laid off. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a terrible strategy.
Oh.
So, I mean, my thoughts on that are, as much as possible, don't hire for the sake of hiring, and don't hire with the intention to fire. I've heard every variation of the phrase, hire fast, fire fast, hire slow, fire slow, hire slow, fire fast, and so forth. Just try to find the best people. In fact, one thing that we're concentrating on this year is, instead of looking at time to fill as a qualitative or quantitative metric, we're actually looking at talent fit, the quality of the hire, as the metric to chase. So time to fill is great. Like, that's the difference, in my opinion, between recruitment and talent acquisition. Your typical recruiter does exactly what they're charged to do, which is fill that seat.
Yeah.
And they're judged on time to fill. How fast can you get somebody there, and so forth. Whereas talent acquisition has to understand the company's needs, and they don't just put somebody in the seat. They want the right person in the right seat. And that's really where we concentrate on. So rather than look at as far as our performance metrics, quality of hire is number one, not time to fill.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with it. And even for me, when, like, I would see a CV or a resume as an advertising document, in the same way that a job specification is, right? So it's like you on a page. So I was talking to a client yesterday, and I had their job spec, and it was atrocious. It was just like a list of duties, and nobody would want to work there. But then when I had the conversation, and I found out, like, their salaries are a little bit lower, but they don't you don't work overtime. Like, you finish at 5, whereas like in the other companies where there might have been a 10K uplift on the salary, you could be there 9-10 p.m. every night. So it actually worked out you'd be worse off taking the higher salary.
Mhm.
But when I was speaking to the clients, one of the things that I had said to them is that as recruiters or agency recruiters, we would send bios on them. And one of the things that I would do is send like motivators or what the person is looking for. Because if that doesn't align with what the client is looking for, there's no point in interviewing, because it gets so stressful interviewing, and there's so much prep that goes into it from a candidate's behalf. Sometimes they're sold a lemon when they go to an interview. Like, what would be your thoughts on that? Have you ever seen that where you don't have to name them, but in any of the companies that you've worked in, that it's just they're so desperate to get somebody in that they make a bad hire, and then it has a ripple effect on the rest of the teams?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that sometimes it's talent acquisition is put in a tough position to begin with, because sometimes you're only hiring the best of what's available out there. And sometimes that means you're hiring the best of the worst, depending on the labor market and
Yeah.
your connections and bench strength and all those things. Like sometimes you're only choosing from what you have to choose from. So I think that that's one constraint that makes it really tough for talent acquisition. And then, right, if the values are not aligned, if you put somebody who's very much in ecologically conscious, and they're put in a company that is petroleum driven, it's probably not going to be a good fit. The job might
That's
be a
the
good
understatement of the podcast.
fit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
probably not going to be a good fit.
very likely. Yeah, so yeah, the job might be a good fit, but the company isn't a good fit in that case, or the person isn't a good fit for the company. And sometimes it's worth going the extra mile, taking a little bit more time to suss that out and find out if the alignment is there in any number of ways. I also think on the other side of that there's some truth to the fact that I see a lot of hiring managers spending a lot of time trying to find the team fit, the culture fit, and tossing away skills. In fact, I hear this a lot, where I can teach them the skills, I just need somebody who works well with the team. And I say, you can teach them the skills, sure, but how long is that going to take you? Do you have 6 to 9 months of runway to teach them the skills? Because you're hurting now. That's why you're looking for somebody. So maybe you should focus on the skills, because the fact is you're always going to have to work with somebody that is not your cup of tea. That's just 3 people in a room. There's going to be 2 that don't get along.
Yeah,
So,
and I think you don't have to, though. I think one of the things, and I only learned this recently, I went through some huge career changes about, like, will it be 3 years in February, but where you're left reeling. Sometimes I think what had happened to me was that and I've said this before, I blurred the line between professional and personal. So then when something goes wrong professionally, it actually affects you as like a human being. And one of the things that I wished I had done earlier would have been to have spoken up. But sometimes you don't want to be troublesome, or especially if you're like a people pleaser, you're not like confrontational or things like that. So I can understand where the thought process comes from, where they wanted to be a team fit. But I do think, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that if you hire for that, like where oh, maybe you're from the same hometown or you have the same interests, you actually lose a lot in relation to diversity of thought. And like, I try and think of it as a castle, with like the different turrets. And if you have like more diverse people, you have like a full 360 view of what's around you and what the threats are, the opportunities. Whereas if you just have everybody who's quite like the manager and they get on and they're all the same age, you just have like one view from one turret. What do you think of that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that sometimes we confuse, diversity with diversity of thought, and I think that that's the most important role at ID Plans. For example, we have a strong philosophy. We actually don't do a lot of. We try not to get too involved in the political leanings of the current climate, because it's a no-win game. But
And
our
it
core
changes a lot.
and it changes a lot. Yes, our core philosophy is just hire the best person for the job. Whoever that is, whatever they look like, it doesn't matter. Just find the best person you can find and let's get them in that position. And when you do that, the diversity of thought is kind of on autopilot. You're not going to find the same character for every position. And your castle analogy is great, because if you have 4 turrets, well, you have choices for those 4 turrets. You can put archers in all 4, and that's great until somebody actually breaks into the castle, and then nobody can fight them. So
Yeah.
you need archers on some, you need trebuchets on some, you need swordsmen on some, and
Yeah.
it's important to have all of those. That's the strategy of HR. That's where I like to focus as well, is thinking through all the strategic implications of our decisions. And I also like to look at the motivators for the positions. In other words, how are we incentivizing the position or the role? Sometimes we think we're measuring something, but we're actually measuring something else. So I'm always
That's so
focused
true.
on those sorts of things.
And in relation to so not necessarily diversity hires, well, I suppose I don't like calling them that, but I would look back at the people that I've placed throughout my career, so not just in my current role, but I make sure that I have a cross section, because I think that, like, if you look at it from a candidate's perspective, the agency recruiter is given a job spec, and then they're paid to get everybody to present candidates who tick all the boxes on this, right? But I think what agency recruiters, and I'm not giving them a hard time, because I am one, and I know that it's very target driven and things like that, and there's a lot of pressure, and you do the best you can with what you have. I mean, like, I know in some agencies you might just have one job advertisement slot, and there's a lot that goes into it, and the majority of them are great and really care about their candidates. But with that said, we have a tendency to find the candidates from the same place. But if I look on reflection, I try to do it at the end of every quarter and look at what are the people like that I've placed in these roles. Are they all like from my type of background, which would have been Dublin, working class, that kind of thing? Or are they all, I don't know, under 25? Are they all religiously this, or are they all this color? And I mean, I'm happy to say, I'm like, self-praise is no praise, but like, the clients that are the candidates that I've placed are like, they're so diverse and in different ways. Like, there was somebody that I placed that like had ADHD, and somebody else who was autistic, but they're bringing in like neurodiversity as well. Do you think that there's a place for that type of reflection in talent acquisition or HR?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think every company has to make that choice, for themselves. They need a talent acquisition strategy. And if diversity is going to be part of it, including neurodiversity or skin color, ethnicity, whatever.
Religion, yeah, all of
Religion, yeah. If that's the kind of organization that you are committed to building, then yeah, you have to look at where are you sourcing from. If you're going to LinkedIn and Indeed, you're getting a bunch of middle-aged white guys, right? Like, I mean, that's who goes to Indeed and LinkedIn. If you're looking for a more diverse population, you have to go where they are, and that may include your local job banks, or as you said, there are institutes that help with the neurodiverse, and a lot of times neurodiverse people make incredible employees. Their focus and dedication in their area of expertise can be off the charts. Software engineers who are autistic tend to do very well in some cases. So it doesn't have to be just your low end labor.
No, 100% not.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is, though, that there's like, and I know I worked with a recruiter who said that, like, there's a home for everyone. And it's just like as though we're matchmakers, I'm finding the right place that we can put them in, and then they can be like, guided and grow and develop. I've had a few candidates, and I do some work with them in EA forum, and that's often a difficult job, because it's one of those roles that's dependent on the person that you're reporting into. It depends on the relationship, not even on the caliber of the work that you're doing. It's like whether they like you, or whether they trust you enough with certain things. But a lot of them had said that the relationship that they would have with their executive would have been quite toxic. And I would have said, why wouldn't you go to HR? But they may be reporting to a CEO,
Mhm.
or a CHRO, or would you have any advice for somebody who finds themselves in a situation where they're reporting to like a senior, an executive, and they're finding the relationship challenging? Like, what steps can they take, or what would you recommend?
I mean, honestly, my first recommendation would be to look inward and decide if it's a deal breaker for you or not. And if it is, then it's time to look elsewhere. At the end of the day, and this is another common misperception about HR is sometimes people think the chief people officer or just HR in general, the HR generalist has absolute and complete autonomous authority over every decision in the company, but no, we all have a boss. We answer to somebody. And if your boss has certain values or commitments, or if it's a privately held company and the owner has certain values or commitments, you are beholden to them. So
Yeah.
you have to keep that in mind. So HR doesn't always have, outside of, legal issues and keeping sure that the compliance is correct. HR still has to cater to the whims and whimsies of the shareholders or the CEO or whoever is above them. So looking at or being in that challenging situation where maybe your leader or report to doesn't share the same values as you, there's a lot of ways that you can take that. If your intent is to stay at the company and try to work it out, then you have to have that conversation with them. And maybe it's not a conversation, it's a series of conversations. If you think about humans as let's say ice cream flavors, there's 8 billion different ice cream flavors in the world. So why would you keep choosing vanilla for every position in your company? So and I think it's okay to have that conversation with leaders, but of course you have to be respectful. You don't want to cross the line where you end up looking for a job unintentionally. So you'd rather be on the intentional end of that if that's the position you're in. So in any position, and if you're not the owner, founder, CEO of your company, there are trade-offs. You have to be aware of those throughout your career. There's always going to be trade-offs. Unless you own the company, you don't get to make all the decisions.
No, and I do think that that's like a really fair point. When you do, and I think that's why the interview process is so important, because that's where you can ask questions like, how many people reported to this person? Why is the role available? What are the touch points per week? Whatever questions might be relevant to your specific role or your specific industry. And I do talk to a lot of candidates or job seekers who think, is it not a bit rude to ask? And I'm like, no. And if they think it's rude, then it's probably because the answers that they're going to give you are not favorable, so, and I'm a firm believer that you can say anything. It just depends on how you say it. But you made a point there that, like, if you're not on the leadership or the board, or you're not the CEO, you are going to have to, like, I suppose take a hit sometimes. But would you recommend that for someone who's having a challenging time with a senior, that do they go to HR first, or would it be better for them to have like a coffee or a casual chat with the person? Because sometimes the person doesn't even realize that they're affecting you in a negative way. It could just be a different form of communication.
Yeah, I would always recommend going directly to the person first to have a conversation. I think a lot of this shows up as well, particularly in remote environments where most of the communication is through, email or Teams or Slack or what have you. A lot of that communication can be taken the wrong way, because when we read an email or a text message, there's no personality to that message. We create the personality in our head, and we create the intention, the cadence, the voice. Everything is just in our heads. We don't know how the person may have actually said the words, or how they, for the sake of brevity, tried to shorten it, which made it sound more direct than they probably would have said it. So I always start with the principle of charity: assume best intentions and have the conversation. Really good.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to look at it, I think, because I always find in those conversations, as somebody who doesn't like to be confrontational, that I want to give them an out. Nobody likes being backed into a corner, like, you made me feel like this, or you said this. It's like, to bring it back to how you felt and you're not sure if you misunderstood it or what their point was. So I think that's it. What was it called? The principle of charity?
Yeah, principle of charity. Just assume best intent for whatever the message or the grievance was, or in a debate, if somebody is taking an opposing view and they say something that sounds really incendiary to you, just assume that they had said it in the best possible way, and repeat it back to them that way. Did you mean this?
And then
And
if
so,
they reiterate that no, they did mean it in the incendiary way, then you know where you stand.
yeah. And then if that conversation doesn't do well for you, HR is a great place to go as the alternative to just say, hey, I'm having this kind of trouble. And HR has some tools at their disposal. I mean, they've probably seen it before. They're probably aware of this person. And sometimes bringing it to HR's attention is a great way to help either somebody take action with that person, or if nothing else, it raises a flag. If they get one complaint, that's two people not getting along. If they get 10 complaints on this person, then there's definitely something there, and it warrants a little bit more scrutiny on that person and the way they're interacting with the team.
There's so many things that you said that I feel like I should be writing down and applying to my own career. I think it's key what you said in relation to the principle of charity, and I think that sometimes we need to do that towards ourselves. I know I had always strived for perfection in work, but that was on the work that I've done on myself more recently. As I said, over the last 2 or 3 years, that was because I was operating from a place of fear. I didn't want to make a mistake, and it was like a self-protection mechanism. And I've since realized that there's no such thing as perfection, and failing shows you're trying. So I have a very good relationship with the word failure now. So when I use this in relation to you, I want you to take it in the principle of charity and how I mean it. But is there any lessons that you've had in your career, or any failures that people could learn from, or that was like a turning point for you?
Oh, my career is littered with failures. I often share the story that my wife, who's amazing, has a picture perfect resume. She graduated college, she got her degree coming out of high school, graduated college, internship, got an entry-level position at a big company. Every move is a progressive step upwards, and now she's an internal auditor for Raymond James Financial, and she's a CPA, and she has I don't know, like 30 letters after her name. She's just amazing. And what's interesting is that both she and I ended up at relatively equal levels of success throughout our careers. But if you look at my resume, it looks like spaghetti. I go forwards, backwards. I've been in imports and trucking. I've been in technology. I did sales. I've been everywhere, and I've always just kind of failed along the way, failed my way to some sort of measure of success. And I honestly can't say which way was better, right? Hers is very structured and very, very well aligned. It definitely looks better on paper. But I probably had more fun doing it, right? So
you sound more like me though. But I do think that comparison is as useful as rolling yourself in glass, and potentially more painful. That's where your self-doubt comes in. So the advice that I'd give, if I'm coaching people, is that really it's just comparing you against you. And what the route that your wife took was the right path for her, and that's why she reached the level of success that she did. And then the route that you took, you could have needed to learn different lessons.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So the path that you would have taken, I was an air hostess, and I remember thinking, what would an air hostess have to do with recruitment, and all of those things. I remember working in an off license, or it's a bottle shop, I don't know what it is in the States, and in the off license, you'd have people who are homeless and come in and buy, the really terrible whiskey or port, and then you'd have the people spending $100 on a bottle of wine, and you really got exposed to a cross section of society. And that's what happens in recruitment. So once I learned how to tailor that experience and transfer those skills, it was oh, that's why I'm good at this. because you can relate to people differently. Whereas before I started in recruitment, if you'd looked at my resume, you would have thought, like, there's no way she's going to be successful in that. But I think if you take the right lessons out of it, which you seem to have done. And did you, like you said that you're in trucking, and then like you moved industries. Was that intentional, or was that just open? Like I'm a believer in the power of yes. Was that you'd meet people and an opportunity would present itself?
Sometimes it was out of desperation. I needed a job. I've been fired. I've left
Meet
prematurely
your
without
sister.
having a backup plan. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've made all the mistakes that young people tend to make in their career, and
Yeah.
I've been through it all. But one thing I've learned is, in what I usually coach, younger managers on is I always say, listen, you can do one of two things: fail big or fail often. Just pick one. But if you're not failing, you're not pushing your limits. You're not finding your limits. You're not pushing yourself. You're not moving it forward in any way. So it's important to fail. I think failure is where success is driven from.
100%,
Yeah.
100%. And you hear this like failing forward. I remember, I'm doing some looking at starting a YouTube channel, and a lot of people who I would speak to are candidates. They, well, I got let go from this job, or and they see these things as a failure. And for me, it's like more about people controlling your narrative. Like if you tell your story with an element of doubt, the person listening to it is going to be doubtful. If you're like, well,
Mhm.
I did this, or like it's controlling your own narrative. And you can mention your failures, but you can focus then more. What I try to do is on the lesson that I strangled out of it. I remember when I was going through it, when I had lost my job, and I was talking to my brother, and I was saying like, why me? And the first thing he said was, why not you?
Mhm.
And I thought, okay. So that knocked me off my pedestal. And then it was like, he said to me that your only responsibility in this situation is to strangle the good out of it. Like,
I love that. So great.
yeah, strangle it. And I tell you, I've been like wringing its neck the best I could. But once I controlled the narrative and allowed myself to be vulnerable and say, look, this happened, and it was like a crisis point for me, but this is what I'm doing to claw my way out of it, and get back to my sense of self. The amount of people who reached out and the amount of goodwill was phenomenal. And it was from just saying like, no, this is actually what happened, like, and it was like a bleep show, but
Mhm.
I'm still here. Like a lot of people will be supportive. Have you found that?
Oh, absolutely. I've always been surprised. Like I'm not the most extroverted person generally. It's just funny because I'm in HR, so I have to put a lot of effort forward sometimes to put myself out there. But I've always been surprised at when I've been at my lowest points, the people who've come out of the woodwork to help, and I've also been surprised by the people who didn't, who I would have expected to, but I've never taken that personally. Like everybody
No.
has their own story, and I kind of think of it as like everybody is the star of the movie of their life, and no one is the bad guy in their movie. So in the movie of your life, somebody else is the bad guy. In fact, everyone else is just a co-star or a bit player
Or
in
an
the background.
extra.
Yeah, they're an extra, and but in each of their lives, they're the star, and you're the extra, the bit player.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that, particularly when you're having a tough conversation in HR, for example. If you're going through something that's a corrective conversation, or perhaps letting somebody go, it's important to do it in a way that allows them the dignity to remain the star of the movie of their life. Like
Yeah.
it's important to let them leave still feeling like the hero. Maybe they got knocked down a notch, but they're still heroic in some way. And I think that's really important. You said something that is very key to almost everything I do. And I think it's a principle that many people miss, which is that we essentially exist in stories. We exist in words. And what I mean by that is, when I have the conversation, I just shared a story with you about my wife. And now that is who my wife is to you. That's how she exists to you. You don't have any other context for her.
No, but
And
I am going to look her up.
she's phenomenal. But if you look at, if I approached it differently and I talked about my wife as, the old ball and chain, or some, I hear guys talk about, being whipped or whatever it is, like, like I always think about, like, really, this is the way you want to present, like, your life and your loved one to the world. Like, this is the way they exist in conversations around you. So you very much do control the narrative of your life, and you build the life that you want. And the only power you have in life is in choosing who you're going to be in the face of whatever situation is in front of you.
Yeah.
So
that's, that's so interesting, because this is the first time I talked about like losing my job in any great detail. Now, it was a long time coming, like, because I had gotten like a therapist to help me organize my thoughts, just when you're in such a level of anxiety that I couldn't, I was going down rabbit holes, so this guy, I've spoken about him before, Billy Brogan, like, he really helped me with it. And I think as well, what saved me was when I was in like the areas of like high like anxiety and things like that. It was because I felt I had no control, and I didn't have control over the situation that I'd been put in. But then I realized that I had control over how I reacted to it, and I had to start then say, okay, well, they're saying this about me. Now I know, like, I've 100 of these flaws, but I 100% know that that's not true. So check that off, the list. And then what also helped me was to look at the people or the situation with kindness and generosity. Like, I remember my mom talking to me about it, and she was like, giving out about the people and saying this, and I'm like, well, they're not monsters. Sometimes it's just like, it's a bad decision, and then that causes like a litany of other decisions trying to correct the first bad decision. So it was like, it became much more simple. It wasn't black and white and I was this and they were this. It was like, it's humans, so I'm going to try and get out of it as unscathed as possible, take the lesson, and hope that they do the same thing. And then it's just like, park it and move on to the next big.
Strangle the good out of it.
Strangle the good. I am strangling. But look, the thing is that if it hadn't have happened, I wouldn't be here talking to you. And if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have my own business. So there's been like, the good has been strangled. So if I had to go through it all again to be here, I would, which is a really nice thing to be able to say, I think.
Yeah, I think that's important for anybody to understand. And it's all trade-offs. Like, there's 100 different paths you could have gone down. So you have to understand there's consequences for whatever path you choose. And as long as you're willing to accept those consequences, good or bad, you're going to be okay. So yeah.
It's good to know. Sorry, it's good to know as well that like that you do have choice. You do have autonomy, like over nothing else. Like maybe everything else has gone, like, I won't swear because I know people in Florida don't like it as much as us Irish.
Oh yeah, that is not true.
Yeah, but everything could be gone like completely sideways. But you still can go, okay, well, this is what I can control, and then get through it like that. I interrupted you. You were going to say something. What was that?
Well, I really like the control the controllables aspect of what you were saying. It was essentially the same thing of just, all the trade-offs and consequences that you have will lead you to, wherever it is that you're going, and just understand that it's all a journey. And I think that sometimes it's true in talent acquisition as well, where, people come to you with a story. And a lot of times where I hear recruiters, or not recruiters, but interviewers go wrong, is that they're trying to put together pieces of a story of a person who's had, however many years of a life behind them, whether it's 18 or 60, and you're having a 10 to 20 to maybe an hour conversation with them, and you're trying to build this whole story of the amalgam of an entire being. And it's really hard to do in such a short time.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it is impossible. And I think that sometimes we make the mistake, and this is why hiring is not a perfect science, because it's very difficult to get all that out of a few minutes of chatter. And a lot of times as the applicant, you go into interview after interview and you feel like, you're just spinning your wheels, you're not getting ahead. It's very defeating and disheartening. But the thing that I try to tell them is, listen, it's not you. Like, you're not doing anything wrong here. It's that you have this very short amount of time, and they're probably not really great at interviewing, so they're listening for the words that they think are the important words. And if
There's
you
a
don't say
science
those
to it.
words,
There's a
yes.
science to it. Like I was saying to somebody the last day that, like, when like the job seeker is thinking, what are they going to ask me about? And I'm like, unfortunately, they don't care about like you being a wonderful human. They don't care, not that they don't care, they don't have the capacity to care in relation to like the constraints that they have on filling this role. So
Mhm.
the things that they're going to ask you in the interview are going to be directly related to their job spec. Anything that you say, and the advice I would give is like, there's no matter whether it's like a panel interview, if it's one-to-one, if it's in, for a senior role, or if it's a junior role, there's three fundamental questions that they have. And it's like, do you want the job? Can you do the job? And do we like you? And in
That's
whatever
great.
form that is, anything that you say in that interview is going to tick one of those boxes. And if you are about to say something that is not relating to can you do the job, do you want the job, or do we like you, don't say it, because like you're wasting your words. And think of it as like a mental checklist that they have in their head, and you're just like ticking off these points for them, and then at
Mhm.
the end they go, wow. Like, so it's the whole mirroring.
Yeah,
um
sage advice.
well, it's not my first day at the rodeo. That's it, I've peaked today. That's my yeah, that's the top bit of advice that I'm gonna give. But that's enough about me. I want to ask you a couple of more questions, outside
Sure.
of talent acquisition and HR. I'm a big proponent of cultures with growth mindsets, and I think you've touched on that, like in your current role,
Mhm.
um, and also in leadership. So, like, what would you think is the key area or the key qualities that a leader would have?
Well, I think integrity is probably chief among them. And by integrity, I mean not only saying what you were going to do, but doing what you said you would do by the time you said you would do it. And it's that last
It's a
part
mouthful.
that everybody misses.
Mm.
Yeah, it is. But I think that that's really important. And where I see that a lot in the world where it kind of fails and falls off the rails, a really great example of that is movie theaters. If you go back to, when I was a kid, so 70s, the movie theaters used to say the movie starts at 8 and you show up at 8 and the movie is starting. But what would happen is most people wouldn't show up at 8. They'd show up at 8:10, 8:15, because they didn't have integrity. They weren't where they were supposed to be by the time they were supposed to be there. So the movie theaters got smart. They said, well, okay, if people are going to show up late, let's put something in front of the time. We'll tell them it starts at 8, but we're going to have 10 minutes of previews. And so they did that. But of course, they never fixed the problem, which is the lack of integrity. So
Yeah.
people started showing up and watching the previews, but pretty soon people became hip to there's 10 to 15 minutes of preview. So they still showed up 10 to 15 minutes late for the movie and still complained that they missed the first part of the movie. So then the theaters got even smarter. They said, well, okay, let's add some commercials before the movie, and then maybe people will show up on time. They never fixed the issue, which is that people just don't have a lot of integrity in general. So I think as a leader, what can set you apart is just having integrity. People want to know something from, like, the biggest predictor of success for a leader is consistency. That's what people value most in leadership. And what I mean by that is even terrible leaders can be effective because they're consistent. If you know your boss is a jerk, you may not like him, but you know how he's going to show up every day. You know what to expect. He's terrible as a human, but he's still effective as a leader. That's how he keeps his job. It's because he's consistent and predictable. Somebody who's not predictable or consistent, you never know which boss you're going to get today. It makes it very difficult to work there. They tend to fail, you tend to fail. It's a disaster. So I don't believe that being a jerk is a good way to go, but you can be effective as that. And where do we see that
For
in
a
a lot?
specific time, I think.
For a specific time. Well, maybe. Like, here's the thing. When I think about effective leaders, right, there's incredible leaders in the world. There's, John F. Kennedy Jr., Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. There are people who've done amazing things through leadership, but there are also people who've done amazing things through leadership in the opposite direction. You have Adolf Hitler, you have Osama bin Laden. I don't know what words you could say to somebody that would make them think like, you know what, it's a good idea to take an airplane and run it into a building and never see my family again. Like, I have no idea what that conversation could possibly look like. But Osama bin Laden knew what to say. I mean, even in the indoctrination, there's still the words. Like, if nothing else, he was an effective leader. Not that I would advocate it, but
No,
I think there's something interesting there about leadership, that it can, you don't have to be a Gandhi or a John F. Kennedy to be an effective leader. It's just better.
Well, I've seen a lot of people. I mean, I had done recorded a podcast, I think, with a transformational leader from one of it's called Erin Road Erin. And he had said that he believes, so it's interesting to get your view on it, that he believes that there's only good leaders, because if you're not a good leader, you're either, like he was saying, that it's leadership is synonymous with, integrity, intellect, maybe consistency, things like that. And he was saying, if you don't have that, you're not a leader. You're maybe like a bad manager, or you're an effective manager, but leadership should be kept for certain words. But when you were talking there about like I suppose almost spectrum of people that you could call leaders, whether it's like leading people in a positive direction or not. One thing that stood out to me is that like these people seem to find the pulse, or what people's fears are, or what their hopes are. So say like you had Obama, who like tapped into yes we can, and then you have somebody else who's like, we'll blame this on the other. I think it's like maybe that's something that they share, is that they can see what people's fears or drivers are, and then they can stir it,
Yes, totally. Or they're very good at painting a picture. And I think that's a fair point about, if you're leading the wrong direction, maybe you're not a leader. I mean, maybe it's a semantic debate. That's a villain and this is a hero, or what have you. But I would counter that either way, they're both leading teams, and, for whatever purpose, Adolf Hitler was effective at that.
Yeah.
Sadly, but I think that's also a good cautionary tale as well, right?
Oh, 100%. But you see it now, even now in Ireland, like the things, I mean, that are on TikTok or Twitter, and Ireland is trending for certain reasons, and it's just like, but it's also sometimes the empty cans carry the make the most noise. So you don't have like good everyday people just going on and saying, I'm a good person. I believe in equality, because that's just, you're busy living your life and being a good person. Whereas that's why I think I try not get, I'm on like an information diet, if that makes sense, because I used to watch the news religiously, but it stays with you, like it's like you're feeding yourself this like toxic stuff, and it like raises your levels of anxiety and things like that. So I'm very careful about the stuff that I watch now.
Sure.
You have to be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I actually take heart in knowing that the news is so toxic, and that it's always so negative. I think about it this way. This is what I call the news principles. We never consider that the reason it's news is because it's abnormal, is because that's not the norm. Those are the exceptions. And if the news was that somebody did something nice for somebody, that would be a world I wouldn't want to live in.
Yeah, that's such a lovely way to look at it. I've never thought about it like that. That is such a lovely way to look at it.
Yeah, so
that'll help me sleep better tonight. I think Well, look, it's a lovely way to end. I've enjoyed, I'm like, we've gone over time, but I've enjoyed speaking to you so much. Um, have you done podcasts before? Have you recorded podcasts before?
Yeah, I've been on a couple Great Things Tampa Bay, Scaling Culture, and
I'll have to
make
have,
sure we,
yeah, you should send me the links and I can share them.
Oh, sure, awesome.
Yeah, I'll share them with the people who will be listening to this. But I'm so grateful for you for coming on. And there's so many things that you said that have really resonated with me, and I know that they really help, especially because you're in that position at, like, you know, the CHRO and the chief people officer, that not everybody gets access
Sure.
you know, to the person behind the title, but you've been very generous with your learnings. And yeah, I'll post all the links for those of you listening to the YouTube site, and I will also post the links to Michael's previous podcasts, but you can only listen to them after you listen to this one. So thank you again, Michael.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me on. Hopefully I was able to deliver something of value for somebody out there. So
you did amazing. You did amazing, honestly.
Thank you.